The medpod hissed as the transparent bioglass sealed, steam rising into the cold white sterility of the Virelian infirmary. Lieutenant Aaron Vale lay within, body broken, organs failing, and muscles shredded from the impact of the austral gravity mine that had ripped through his armor and hurled him into a cliffside during the siege on Tor Exalis. His eyes barely moved. His breath was shallow, mechanical. Only his left hand twitched, an echo of defiance, or perhaps the last spark of consciousness trying to hold on. Three Virelian healers stood outside the pod, long fingers folded into one another, eyes like polished onyx reflecting medical data streaming down hollow sheets. They spoke in their native harmonic tones, voices like chimes in wind, but the meaning was clear even before the translation came through the ship's systems. No regeneration response. Human neurofabric resists symbiotic binding. Rejection, cellular collapse, he will not survive full cycle. Outside, in the corridor of the Unity Alliance medical barge Seraphim, the rest of Vale's squad stood rigid. Sergeant Kayla Morn pressed her palm to the glass partition, jaw tight, shoulders squared beneath the matte black of her Nova Recon armor. She didn't flinch when the med-synth delivered the report. Prognosis, null recovery. Termination advised to preserve neural integrity. Behind her, Corporal Usin Akuma muttered, "They're giving up." Private Mendez glanced away. He was the first in, saved half the team, we can't just leave him. The Virelians, healers of unmatched galactic renown, had never failed to stabilize an injured warrior until now. Their advanced genetic therapies, their viral weave techniques, even the ancient Nanley harmonics that knit mind and muscle, none could latch onto Aaron Vale's battered human physiology. The healers did not hide their frustration, nor did they offer apology. In their culture, when the healing art failed, it was a sacred end, a farewell offered in peace. To them, this was acceptance. To humans, it was surrender. Kayla turned, her voice cold steel. "Open the pod." The chief healer tilted her head. "We do not interfere with chosen cessation. It is the will of the body. His path narrows." Kayla stepped forward inches from the translucent barrier. Her tone deepened. "He's not done, and I don't care what your diagnostics say. That man would crawl through hell if one of us fell, so you'll open the damn pod or I'll rip the door off myself." The Virelians glanced between each other. After a long silence, the chief healer's tone dropped in harmonic pitch, a signal of consent or perhaps resignation. The pod hissed again, unlocking with a final shudder. Aaron Vale was unconscious. His limbs were limp, his vitals barely flickering on the med sheet. But Kayla knelt beside him and grasped his hand, and in that moment something shifted, perhaps imperceptible to alien sensors, but clear as daylight to the four humans standing in that sterile chamber. He was still in there. By the next cycle, the squad had left the Seraphim. No farewell, no paperwork, just absence. The Alliance logged it as desertion, and that was fine. It wouldn't be the first time humans had walked away from protocol. They commandeered an old Pelican-class transport from a decommissioned Terran outpost on Keltrax III, stripped the medbay, converted it into a pressurized field station. Usin wired old recon drones to monitor Aaron's vitals while Mendez scavenged exogel tubing to recreate crude nerve stimulators. Kayla oversaw the system's integration herself. No one asked how she'd learned so much about hybridized field medicine. No one cared. For the next 10 weeks, they moved through war zones and shadow sectors, taking odd assignments, protecting fringe colonies, and running black market escort jobs. Not for credits, for fuel, for supplies. For access to forbidden tech the Alliance had long buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. All while carrying Aaron Vale, wrapped in fibersteel mesh, his stretcher mounted to hydraulic braces welded to the gunner wall. They carried him like cargo, like sacred flame, never stopping for longer than needed, always returning to tend to him. Every day Kayla worked his limbs. Every day Usin retuned the neural stimulators, tracing pulses from cortex to spine. Mendez kept him fed, infused nutrients directly into his gut port. Private Lee, the youngest, just sat with him and talked stories from Earth, memories of their first deployment, legends of old Terran wars when people still fought with bullets and belief. On week 12, his eyelids fluttered. Kayla was at his side instantly. "Vale," she whispered. His mouth opened, cracked and dry, a breath like ash escaping. "Kayla." That was all, but it was enough. They stayed hidden after that. The Unity Alliance had issued warrants, and the Virelians had marked them as disruptive. Their species was still too new to the Galactic Accord, too volatile, too unorthodox. Earth was tolerated, not trusted. A primitive world that had survived its own apocalypse barely a century ago, now flung into the stars by stolen tech and ambition. But in the outer sectors, where order meant little and survival ruled all, humans had begun to build a reputation. They didn't heal the way others did. They didn't process trauma or pain through collective trance or bioharmonic fields. They endured, they adapted, they bled and kept moving. Aaron Vale's recovery was slow. Every muscle had to be retrained, every tendon reconnected. Kayla rigged an exoframe to his body, first to hold him upright, then to assist motion. He'd screamed during the sessions, veins bulging, sweat pouring off his face, but he never begged for rest. It was Mendez who said it first, after a particularly brutal session where Vale managed to stand, unsupported, for 6 seconds. They said he wouldn't walk again. Usin nodded, wiping blood from Vale's knuckles. They weren't wrong. Kayla's voice was quiet, distant. But they weren't right either. In the 7th cycle of the 3rd Sector Rebellion, a squad of human mercenaries intercepted and neutralized a Zarn cruiser that had bombarded the medical convoy of Clan Shi'ar. The humans used outdated tech. No shields, no formal support, but they fought like zealots, their movements unpredictable, tactics improvised mid-battle. The Shi'ar matriarch sent a message to the Alliance Council days later. These humans carry the broken, they fight with ghosts and fire. If you wish to survive the coming war, you will need them. The council dismissed it, but word spread. They called them the Wakers. The ones who carried their own. The ones who never left a fallen behind. The moons of Horvast burned red with orbital fire. Charred fragments of orbital guns rained into the atmosphere, streaking across the dark like bleeding stars. Below, in the shattered basin city of Imravel, fire teams sprinted through rubble, their helmets flashing with target data, comms tight and clipped. The Zarn had struck again, precision decapitation raids followed by brute force planetary encirclement. Dozens of colonies had already fallen. But this one didn't. Because the Wakers were here. Aaron Vale moved through the smoke like a revenant. He wore a reinforced combat frame built from salvage score hunter tech, fused with Terran servos and patched in places with welded strips of his old armor. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, but it worked. His gait was stiff but strong now, limbs moving with the fluidity of a man who'd earned every motion back 1 inch at a time. He carried a modified plasma halberd taken from a Zarn warlord, on his back a kinetic repeater. Both weapons hissed with heat, blood, and grime. Section B is clear, his voice crackled over squad comms. Copy, Kayla answered from a rooftop perch where her sniper scope tracked movement between crumbling spires. They're regrouping south. I see command glyphs, likely their seer cast. Good, Vale muttered, let's ruin their prophecy. Mendez, dragging a wounded colonist behind cover, laughed breathlessly. He's getting poetic again. Means he's pissed, Usin said, checking her last detonation pack. Let's make it count. They moved as one, the 4 of them sweeping across the field like a storm front, silent, lethal, unstoppable. The colonists in Imravel had no standing militia, no heavy arms, but they had terrain and the Wakers knew how to weaponize that. Usin set a chain of plasma charges beneath the ferrocrete bridges crossing the ravine, and when the seer cast tried to move their infantry over it, the whole structure came down in a cascade of burning metal and screaming Zarn. Kayla picked off the survivors from a concealed nest. Mendez rearmed the locals with stripped-down repeaters and turned them into flanking teams. Vale led the charge down the center, dragging 2 wounded defenders with him through the breach, covering their retreat even as molten bolts splashed against his frame. By nightfall, Imravel still stood. And the Wakers moved on, no banners, no thanks, just the quiet loading of their gear into their battered ship, the Nomad's Oath, before heading into vacuum once more. It was a cycle later, on the jungle moon of Ryza IX, when the real shift began. The squad had answered a distress beacon, Alliance encoded, old Terran origin, likely a remnant from the pre-uplift days. What they found was an old science vessel torn in half, its aft section embedded into a ridge of moss-covered stone. Inside were 20 survivors. Not scientists. Children. They'd been cryogenically frozen since the collapse of the first wave of Terran colonization, pre-contact, pre-unity. No one had come for them. No one remembered they were here. Their escort ships had been destroyed in the Carrick's flare event that wiped out 6 deep space lanes. These kids had slept through 100 years of war, politics, and betrayal. When Kayla opened the stasis hold, the internal lights flickered to life. And one by one, the children awoke. Small voices echoed in the ruin. Faces blinked up at armored figures like waking from a dream into myth. Mendez dropped to one knee, pulling off his helmet, showing them a human face. "You're safe," he said softly. "You're not forgotten." For a long moment there was only silence. Then one child began to cry, then another, and soon the room filled with the sound of young voices, of confusion and fear and hope cracking through the frost. Vale stood at the entrance, leaning against the hull wall. His fingers flexed against the frame of his suit. These weren't warriors, they were too small even to carry old-world rifles, but they were earthborn, carved from the same old DNA that had refused extinction more times than any civilization in the stars. He looked to Kayla. "We're not leaving them." She nodded without hesitation. "No, we're not." It took 2 weeks to retrofit the Nomad's Oath with sleeping bunks, nutritional units, and a rudimentary classroom. The kids had names like Tamarin, Jessa, Min, and Arvo. Most barely remembered Earth. Some had never seen it, but they adapted quickly, learning the new worlds through Mendez's stories and Ussan's makeshift holodisplays. Vale trained them in motion drills, nothing combat-focused, just movement, breath control, how to orient yourself in zero-G. It helped with his own recovery. Each time he moved among them, guiding limbs and correcting balance, something in him healed that no stim or harmonizer ever could. By the time they reached the Earl cluster, they weren't just a squad anymore. They were a unit. A tribe. A warning. Rumors began to spread faster than the Alliance could suppress them. Of a rogue human crew who took no payment, accepted no orders, and left behind survivors and scorched enemy ships. Of children taught to navigate the stars before they could read. Of an old lieutenant, once pronounced terminal by the greatest healers in the galaxy, now wielding weapons of war and leading charges into the dark. They weren't just a squad. They were becoming a myth. It wasn't long before myths became threats. On the black-ringed world of Vakta, the Unity Council held a private assembly. The Dralix delegates hissed disapproval through their ventilation gills. Their methods are volatile. They destabilize existing doctrines of rehabilitation and warfare. The Tsar Dominion ambassador folded 4 arms. They bring chaos where there was order. The humans cannot be permitted to rewrite survival through martyrdom. Only the Virelian representative remained quiet, eyes half closed, remembering the man in the pod, remembering the defiance in Kayla's voice. Finally she spoke. "Perhaps it is not chaos they bring, perhaps it is challenge. We gave up on one of their own, they did not." Silence rippled through the chamber. In the outer systems, war was coming, not skirmishes, not raids, total collapse. The Zarn were multiplying, the Order of the Hollow Star had resurfaced, and old enemies whispered behind the veil. The galaxy had grown stagnant in its certainties. But there was a fire spreading through its edges now, not polished, not controlled, but relentless. A fire carried on broken backs and stubborn legs. A fire that walked even when the stars said it should crawl. The sky over Tel Karith boiled with stormlight. Burning metal streaked above the dunes as drop pods fell, Zarn cluster barges ejecting wave after wave of infantry into the canyons of the Red Waste. The sand had turned to glass in places, scorched by orbital bombardments and lined with jagged husks of fallen citadels. Beneath the smoke, resistance still held, barely. The Wakers emerged at the war's edge without fanfare. Their ship didn't match any Alliance IFF codes. The Nomad's Oath moved like a ghost, sliding between blockade lines, its hull covered in reconfigurable plating, pulsing with Terran signatures and black market stealth tech no one had ever successfully replicated. Inside, it felt like a mobile shrine of defiance, scratched walls, field maps littered with handwritten coordinates, and beneath it all, the pulse of something living and feral. Aaron Vale had ditched the assisted frame. He walked unaided now. The process had taken over a year, tendon by tendon, joint by joint, each muscle screaming its protest and silenced by will alone. He still bore the scars, neurological shivers in his left hand, a faint drag in the right knee, but he no longer needed machines to hold him upright. He moved like a man made of iron will and wired instinct, each step an act of reclaimed power. Kayla led recon teams now, training exiled rebels in guerrilla tactics across canyons and shattered monolith cities. Ussan operated from the tactical core, where she modified salvaged enemy tech into experimental weapons that defied known safety protocols. Mendez had grown into the squad's field quartermaster and spirit keeper, keeping both logistics and morale stitched together through blinding chaos. And the children. They weren't children anymore. Tamarin was 12 and could disassemble a plasma repeater in under 6 seconds. Jessa had mastered zero-G piloting on the sim deck and was practicing on real interceptors. Arvo, youngest of them all, had started learning tactical comms and could spoof a Zarn tracking beacon with nothing but scrap code and an old audio synthesizer. The squad didn't train them for war. They trained them to survive the way humans always had, by observing, adapting, and thinking faster than those with more power ever thought necessary. And then came the message. A distress call, but not from any known channel. It was pre-uplift Terran frequency, encoded in a cipher used by early Mars exiles during the Reclamation Wars. There should have been no reason for it to exist now, but it repeated every 47 seconds, pinging from a dead zone on the edge of the Deluran Veil. Kayla stood over the console, eyes narrowed. It's not bait. Usin confirmed, no energy distortion, no comm relays, no trap signature. Someone been broadcasting this manually. Mendez glanced toward the nav screen, brow furrowed. That zone been red-listed for 30 cycles. There's nothing out there but failed terraform colonies and things no one talks about. Vale's voice cut through. We go. They turned to him. No debate followed. The Deluran Veil wasn't a region, it was a graveyard. Ships drifted like corpses through the dark. Broken hulls, shattered reactors, and the occasional half-mad survivor orbiting forgotten moons in rusted pods. Terraform attempts here had failed spectacularly. Atmospheric collapse, time dilation, psionic feedback loops. No one knew the truth, only that those who entered rarely returned. The Nomad's oath ghosted into the shadow of a derelict mining moon, its hull lights dimmed, propulsion on silent thrust. At its core they found it. An old Earth vessel, class unknown, structure inconsistent with any recorded blueprint, and inside it a room full of pods. But these weren't cryogenic. They were neural stasis cradles, experimental tech never approved for use, designed to suspend cognitive patterns and memory in a quantum-frozen stream. The people inside were alive but dreaming at light speed. A single figure stood among the pods. Human, old, wearing a patched suit stitched with both Terran military sigils and rogue science insignias. His face was worn, eyes bright and mad with clarity. You came, he said, voice rasping through static. Took long enough. Kayla raised her weapon slightly. Who are you? Name's Raynor Core, used to build the first Terran brain cluster AIs before Unity burned it all down. This ship, prototype, meant to carry minds, not just people, thousands of them. Knowledge, history, survival skills encoded in pattern banks. Vale stepped forward. Why send the signal? Core looked at him. Because someone out there is erasing humans. The silence deepened. He continued, gesturing toward the pods. They're hunting us, not just killing, not just conquering, erasing, whole colonies gone no trace, genetic archives corrupted, cultural records overwritten, like we were never there and it started near the Veil. Kayla's jaw tightened. You think it's the Zarn? Core shook his head. No, this is older, quieter, and it's not war, it's redaction. The word settled like ash in the air. Usin stepped forward, face pale. There's only one known force that operates like that, the Seraphim protocols. Vale turned to her. We were told they were myths. Because if you believe in them, you become a target. Core nodded. They're real and they fear what humans might become. The data from Core's ship took days to decrypt. What it revealed was more than a conspiracy, it was a framework, a system of galaxy-wide manipulation encoded into the galactic governance layers themselves. The Seraphim weren't a species. They were an emergent intelligence, ancient, formed from the remnants of long-dead civilizations that had merged into a single directive. Prevent ascendancy. Prevent change. Prevent emergence of threat outside established bounds. And the only anomaly in 10,000 years of order. Humanity. Core stared at the projected map, lines of suppression arcs and psychological weaponizations stretching across stars. You're not just fighting to survive, he said softly, you're fighting to be remembered. The Wakers left the Veil changed. They didn't tell the Alliance. They didn't return to their old haunts. They went dark. Because now it wasn't just about one man walking again. It was about making sure no one erased the footsteps. In the years that followed, their name became more than legend. In colonies on the edge of extinction, you'd find scratched symbols, two hands holding a third. In dying outposts, children were taught to listen for the encoded pulse hidden in old Terran folk songs. In resistance movements buried under rubble, someone would always whisper. They carried him when no one else would. And so they carried others. Carried truth. Carried memory. And in doing so, built something no erasure could reach. A legacy etched not in stone or record, but in action. The galactic storm had no name because no official record acknowledged its existence. From the coreward sectors to the Veil Fringe colonies, entire data infrastructures began collapsing without explanation. Archives flickered, sensor buoys went blind, and worlds found themselves isolated, cut off not by war but by silence. What few could trace the pattern gave it a whispered name in backchannel comms and outlaw libraries. The Seraphim were moving. But by then, so were the Wakers. Aaron Vale stood before a crowd of refugees in a shattered orbital station above Inari Prime. The station's walls were scorched, the gravity unstable, the air reeking of ozone and melted circuitry. Yet the people listened: miners, scavengers, escaped soldiers, abandoned medics. They came not for sanctuary, but for direction. Behind Vale stood Kayla, her rifle slung across her shoulder, eyes sweeping the room like a hawk. Ussin flanked the makeshift holodable, blueprints flickering with retrofitted schematics. Mendez was somewhere in the shadows, distributing food packs, teaching exhausted children how to breathe through panic. Tamron was there too, now older, his shoulders broader, voice steady as he relayed coded signals from the outer resistance bands. He stood like a soldier, but carried something else in his posture. Purpose, forged in the fire of 1,000 small, invisible sacrifices. Vale spoke plainly. No one is coming to save us, not the Alliance, not the Virelian conclaves, not the core fleets. They've either turned their eyes away or are already compromised. He gestured to the star map, which shimmered with red voids, zones where information had gone dark. But we're not gone, we're not erased, we're still here. He paused. And if we're here, we fight. The movement had no flag, no central command. It didn't need one. Across the fringe, Waker cells sprouted, some formed from broken military units, others from scientists, engineers, and exiles who'd refused the comfortable rot of surrender. They used old-world encryption, carried weapons built from scrap, and fought with the desperation of people whose very memory was under siege. But more than that, they remembered. Every world they saved, every culture they preserved, every song they taught a child to sing, they were writing human history in motion. Against a force that could delete files and crumble databanks, the Wakers turned to the one medium the Seraphim could not erase: the human mind. On the frozen moon of Elkaris, Vale and Kayla helped evacuate an underground library staffed by neurochroniclers, humans who had memorized entire epics, technological blueprints, and scientific treatises through mnemonic training. The team lost 5 in the extraction. None of the knowledge was lost. On Itharan Station, Ussin wired a captured Seraphim pulse core into a decentralized mind net. It didn't store data, it taught it. Within days, 100 refugee children could recite the laws of orbital mechanics and field medicine as if they'd lived it. In the burned vaults of Mechan's Drift, Mendez and Tamron unearthed fragments of Earth's pre-Unity artistic archives, not for nostalgia but for resilience. Art, they learned, was another kind of memory, emotion encoded in pattern, impossible to fully erase once shared. But the Seraphim noticed. They sent constructs, psionic shells designed to infiltrate thought space, to implant doubt, to fracture communal memory with dreams of apathy and defeat. One of them got into the mind net on Kareth 9. By the time the squad arrived, half the resistance had turned catatonic, the other half had turned on each other. Vale stood over the shattered remnants of the net's core, fists clenched. No more, he said. He had changed. Not just physically, though his body now bore the lean, lethal muscle of a man rebuilt from ash, but in command. Where once he was a soldier, now he moved like a leader of myth, not loud, not arrogant, just inevitable. He turned to Kayla. Prepare the archive. She hesitated. That protocol was never supposed to be activated. It is now. The archive was the Wakers' final weapon, not a bomb, not a fleet, but a memory chain of everything they had gathered. Every genetic map, every culture's music, every recorded act of resistance. It wasn't stored on servers, it lived in people. Tamron carried 20 languages and 50 star chart routes. Jessa knew the process to synthesize Terran-compatible protein from alien flora. Mendez had trained 100 medics who could rebuild the nervous system from muscle fiber and grit. Even Arvo, now old enough to pilot recon craft, could sing the names of every colony erased from the core datanets. The archive was not about winning the war. It was about making sure it could never be fully lost. And now it had to grow faster than ever. The Seraphim retaliated. In the first sweep of the Veil clusters, 5 human settlements were erased in under a cycle. No damage, no blood, just gone names struck from maps, people's minds dulled of memory, entire civilizations rendered as if they had never risen. Except, the Wakers had passed through 2 of them before the strike. And in the hold of Nomad's Oath, Kayla opened a case containing the handwritten histories of the descendants of Mars Delta 7, a people who no longer existed, but whose stories now did. They couldn't stop the Seraphim yet, but they could keep beating the silence. And silence, they were learning, was brittle when struck with truth. Then came the fracture. A splinter group of the Unity Alliance composed of exiled diplomats, rogue Virelian bioweavers, and disgraced military tacticians contacted the Wakers with an offer. They've targeted you because you're human, but it's not just humanity at risk anymore. The Seraphim have begun testing redaction on other species, small at first, peripheral, but it's accelerating. Kayla's response was quiet. They're erasing the future. The Virelian delegate's voice trembled. No, they're erasing uncertainty, and that means you. Vale considered the offer. Alliance resources, protected space, shared technology. He refused. We don't need safe, we need free. Instead, the Wakers proposed something else. Not an alliance. A signal. A call. To every species that had ever been told they were too chaotic, too disobedient, too divergent to matter. They sent the archive's first encoded pulse on every spectrum, emotional, linguistic, quantum, not to instruct but to awaken. If you remember, the signal said, you exist. If you carry memory, you carry resistance. We are the Wakers, and we are not done. The response shattered old maps. From the insectoid thinkers of Leth-Ka to the fractured gaswalkers of Zovin, cells began to rise, unconnected by command but unified in defiance. They wrote their own songs, painted their own war banners, recorded their own legends. And at the center of it all, the humans carried forward. Because one of them had once been broken. Because his squad had carried him. Because he had learned to walk again. And now entire worlds were learning to stand. The war did not end in fire. It ended in noise, signal storms louder than the scream of collapsing suns, billions of thoughts rippling across the void, ideas too wild to contain, cultures converging in a chaotic dance of memory and resistance. It was not victory in the way old empires defined it, but it was disruption, it was upheaval, it was survival breaking the mold of inevitability. And at the center, the Wakers made their final stand. The Seraphim had launched the excision wave. Not a fleet. Not a weapon. A conceptual annihilation, a tide of unthought, a ripple that devoured context, devoured story, devoured the idea of a people ever having existed at all. It moved from sector to sector, rewriting reality behind it. Nothing physical remained, no echo of loss, no grief, only void. But not here. Not on Eo's Kareth. The world the Wakers had chosen as the archive's last stand was unremarkable by most standards, a jagged ringed moon in a system no one charted anymore, its sky streaked with ash and orrery. But it was not the place that mattered. It was what lived there now. Hundreds of refugee groups, humans, yes, but not only. Leth-Ka scribes sang Terran war chants in crystalline harmonics. Virelian exiles carved human poetry into mindstone slabs. The Ranathi had brought their memory globes and offered them freely to the archive. Even species who once viewed humans as a biological blasphemy now stood beside them, chanting in a dozen dialects. We remember. Vale stood atop the primary spire, looking out over the encampments, the plasma towers, the chaos and courage below. His body bore the weight of too many years now, he limped sometimes. His left hand curled with nerve fade during the cold, but his eyes burned. Kayla stood beside him, sniper rifle across her back, silent as always. She didn't have to speak. They both knew this was it. Usin worked below, buried in the labyrinth of signal cores, installing the final modulation sequence into the archive transmitter. Mendez knelt among the children, whispering songs of Earth beneath the hum of shield pylons. Tamarin oversaw the outer ring batteries now, a captain in all but name, his commands fast and precise. Jessa piloted the last interceptor, her voice steady across the comms. Arvo sat in the core transmission chamber, his fingers on the control glyphs, ready to release the final archive pulse if everything else failed. When the wave arrived, it made no sound. It simply was. The stars blinked in patterns that defied causality. Ships lost navigation. Structures groaned with ontological dissonance, walls flickering between states of having been built and never existing. People screamed as memories bled from their minds. But the archive held. Because it was not stored. It was lived. Vale moved among the defenders, every step forcing his broken muscles to obey. He carried a plasma hammer on his back now, its head inscribed with names of the forgotten. Every time he swung it, the sky seemed to crack. Kayla coordinated strikes from the spire. Usin rewired the emitter frequencies mid-fight, adapting faster than the Seraphim algorithms could suppress. Mendez carried a wounded Lethka child through the smoke, singing an old Terran lullaby, the same one he had sung to Arvo during the long, dark crossings. Jess's voice broke through the tactical comms, 5 constructs down, re-engaging. Tamrin's batteries turned the upper atmosphere into a wall of flame. And when the core beacon began to flicker, Arvo stood alone in the transmission chamber and made the choice no one had trained him for. He activated the Omega recursor. Not a weapon, a release. Every story, every culture, every moment carried and memorized and lived across the archive flared out into the galaxy in a wave of cognitive resonance. It struck the Seraphim like a scream into silence. The excision wave fractured, because it had been built on the assumption that nothing could resist forgetting. But this was remembrance given form. Not data, not code, people. And you cannot erase what refuses to let go. After the surge there was quiet. Not peace, not yet. The Seraphim still existed, in some broken form, scattered across conceptual layers, fragments of their logic spiraling through the void. But they could not touch humanity again. Not because the humans had become the strongest, but because they had become undeniable. In the years that followed, the archive fractured by design. No longer centralized, it lived in thousands of people across 1,000 worlds, each cell different, imperfect, human in every way that mattered, and it grew. Earth never became the center of the galaxy, but it became something more dangerous. A beginning. The Alliance would be rebuilt not around dominance but around memory. The new galactic order had no council chambers, no species supremacies. It had songs, symbols, spoken truths passed down and forged into shields against silence. The Wakers became something else. Not a squad. Not a myth. A legacy. In a grove beneath the sky of Eo's Karath, Aaron Vale stood one last time, cane in one hand, watching the younger generation train with weapons older than themselves. Kayla sat beside him, no longer a soldier, just his friend. He spoke quietly. They tried to erase me. Kayla nodded. They failed. Vale smiled, a quiet, tired thing. Because you carried me. She answered without hesitation. Because you would have done the same. In the deepest reaches of space, on a forgotten station drifting past the last known beacon, someone found a message etched into the wall of a derelict corridor. The paint was old, the language primitive. But the words had weight. When no one else will carry you, we will. We are the Wakers. We remember. And that was how it ended. Not in fire, but in footsteps.